Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Yiddish Magic, Yiddish Power from the JCC of Metro Detroit. My name is Jamie Loeb, and I am thrilled to have all of you here. I am the Senior Director of Cultural Arts here at the JCC of Metro Detroit, and it is my honor to be the director of both the SAJE program and the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, who are the co-presenters of this evening's event. The SAJE program, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, is one of our many programs at the JCC for education, arts, culture, and really anything else you can think of. So today we are also very thrilled to have some partners with us from outside the JCC, the Sholem Aleichem Institute of Michigan, the Workers' Circle of New York City, and the Workman Circle Arbiter Ring of Michigan. We're very, very excited to have all of you with us this evening. We also wanted to let you know that our friends over at the Sholem Aleichem Institute of Michigan will be hosting an informal virtual schmooze after the event, and there are still some slots left for the registration. So you can go on over to our website right down there. Here, I'll make it a little bigger for you. That's our website right down here. Go over there. There's a link to register. So there are still a few slots available if you're interested in some schmoozing after the event. So while you're here at our YouTube channel, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the reminders button, all of those YouTube things. It's a great way to keep abreast of all of our exciting events that are going on and help streamline your experience when you come back. Of course, you can always go to our website down here for a list of events, ways to sign up for our email blasts, and of course, ways to help support our work. So if you are watching on a computer, you should be able to put your comments in the comment section below, and we will see them as we go. If not, you can text your comments here, and questions, of course, 248-973-7286. We will keep this number on the screen for you, so don't worry. Feel free to let us know what you're thinking, ask questions of our guests. Of course, they have a wonderful discussion prepared. I think you're really going to enjoy it, but they will take as many of your questions as they can. So speaking of comments, I believe we have some people watching from outside of the Metro Detroit area. So do drop us a line in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from so that we can say hello from Detroit. So we here at the JCC of Metro Detroit are really thrilled that we've been able to provide you, our community, and beyond, all of this exciting free programming throughout the pandemic and really until who knows when. But we need your help to keep doing it. So if you enjoy this event, if you've enjoyed some of our other events, if you might have been willing to pay to come to an event like this, then we hope you'll consider making a donation or becoming a cultural arts patron. Of course, you can do all of that at our website, jccdet.org/cultural event. Cultural arts. I didn't say that. Cultural arts. So now to today's event. We are so thrilled to have with us two wonderfully fascinating and so different scholars from the world of Yiddish language. First, we have Ilan Stavans, who I keep pronouncing his name wrong. I'm sorry, Stavans. I'll get there. He's the publisher of Restless Books and a professor at Amherst College. His books include On Borrowed Words, Spanglish, Dictionary Days, The Disappearance, and A Critic's Journey. He's edited the 3-volume set of Isaac Bashevis Singer's collected stories, the poetry of Pablo Neruda, and dozens of other volumes. He's the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Guggenheim Fellowship, Chile's Presidential Medal, the International Latino Book Award, and of course, the Jewish Book Award. His work has been translated into 20 languages and has been adapted for both stage and screen. He is the co-founder of Great Books Summer Program at Amherst, Stanford, Chicago, Oxford, and Dublin. And of course, he is the host of NPR's podcast, In Contrast. Arun Viswanath grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, not far from some of my relatives, in a Yiddish and Tamil-speaking home. So, yes, Harry Potter is his first foray into literary translation, previously having translated letters and historical documents. Arun enjoys bouldering, playing board games, and learning new languages and instruments. He resides with his wife, Tali, in New York, where he works in analytics at a tech company. So please join me in welcoming Ilan Stavans and Arun Viswanath.
Thank you, Jamie, very much. Arun, it's such a pleasure to be together with you in conversation. And thank you to the large audience that is watching us in Detroit and in many other places. I want to start by celebrating you for having just published the Yiddish translation of Harry Potter. It seems like a quixotic enterprise, an astonishing feast for many of us who are passionate about the Yiddish language. And just a joy to know that among the 80 different translations that Harry Potter, the many installments, has been rendered into, the Mameloshen is now one of them. Very few people know, or I guess very few people know, that Sweden has as one of its official languages Yiddish. Here in the United States, we debate ferociously about the languages that the government can or cannot or should not use. In Sweden, the Yiddish language is one of several that are sponsored and underwritten by the government. And I say this because your book is published with the help of the Swedish government. I love the irony of all this. In a Tamil, Yiddish-speaking, English-speaking home, being sponsored by a publisher in Sweden, Harry Potter, a world of mystery and magic and witchcraft. Now, let me first ask you, it seems, as I said, quixotic to try to render in Yiddish Harry Potter, perhaps because Yiddish is, we are told time and again, and we refuse, right, Arun, to accept this, a dying language. When Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize in 1978, in front of the Nobel Committee, he said, this language has been dying and dying and dying and can't make it there. It will continue that way. Tell me about the experience.
Dr. Stavans, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. I, of course, have your book here as well. It's an amazing anthology. I recommend it for everybody in the audience as well. And the irony of you using the word quixotic is not lost on me. And I, of course, also think about how Don Quixote, or in Yiddish, Don Quixote, is one of the many works of literature which were translated into Yiddish for the Yiddish-speaking masses who actually didn't have access to the source languages. Of course, Harry Potter is quite different because, for the most part, except for some stubborn holdouts, Harry Potter typically has already been read by any reader in English. For me, it was actually very much a personal enterprise. I grew up, as you mentioned, speaking Yiddish with my mother and my entire mother's side of the family, and Tamil, which is a language from South India, with my father and my father's side of the family. And English was actually not a language of the house. In fact, we were strictly forbidden from speaking English. And growing up, of course, I grew up in the 90s, so it was already a time when the Yiddish language, in many ways, mainstream secular, quote unquote, secular Yiddish culture was already in decline. And it was certainly the case that there weren't any glitzy, colorful children's books, certainly not young adult fantasy being published in Yiddish. And for me, that was quite difficult growing up, as I did in suburban New Jersey, not having something that I felt could really rival what I was reading in English. And so I carried that for many years, that feeling that I wish that I'd been able to have something like this growing up. And one of the things that I sort of resolved for myself in a very amorphous way was, how can I make sure that I can do something towards changing that situation. And of course, I don't mean in any way to discount the large amount of publishing that's happening from the Hasidic community. First of all, of course, the Hasidic community is not publishing Harry Potter. And on the other hand, I think in my experience, the themes that were covered in Hasidic children's literature were typically a little bit narrower, oftentimes a little bit more moralizing. But the real trigger for starting to work on the Harry Potter project was when I married my wife, Tali. We were speaking, she's not a born speaker of Yiddish, but we were sitting together on a Shabbos afternoon on a Saturday, and I had been very clear with her up front that I wanted to raise our future children speaking Yiddish. And she turned to me, and she's a very big Harry Potter fan, and she said, "Are you really planning on raising Yiddish-speaking children in a world without Harry Potter?" And of course, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, my mom managed it, but I certainly felt that gap, and I immediately got started on the project.
Terrific.
Yeah.
I grew up in Mexico City. I went to Yiddish school. Yiddish was the language of home. Spanish was the language of the streets. We studied Mexican history in Yiddish. We studied also Shalom Aleichem and Peretz and Bashev Zinger and Mendel Moiches Forum. And for me, it was always very clear where I would use the Yiddish and where I would use the Spanish. There were, as if my brain was compartmentalized, and I knew it would switch to using Yiddish with certain groups of people, and then Spanish if I was playing soccer or I was in the neighborhood with the neighborhood friends. And then I became an immigrant in the mid-'80s. This is before you were born, and I was absolutely shocked by two things. First, that my Yiddish was absolutely useless in New York, in the worlds that I was moving in, not in the Hasidic community, not necessarily in the workman circle. I was moving among Latinos in certain sections of Washington Heights. But I was shocked, Arun, by something that I started listening that reminded me of Yiddish very deeply, and that was Spanglish. The mix of Spanish and English, the mishmash, the contaminated mameloshen of Latinos. And I say mameloshen because it reminded me so much of how Yiddish was born about a millennia ago. The mixing of German and Hebrew spoken by the illiterate, by women, by children. There was a very determined approach by the Talmudists, by the rabbis, by the religious elite, not to give credit, not to legitimate the Yiddish language until many centuries later. Some writers, like the ones that I listed, Shalom Aleichem and Peretz and Avramovich, decided that if they wanted to be successful, they could not write novels in Hebrew. They needed to write them in the language that the folks would be able to understand. And I was mesmerized by this Spanglish. And I'm telling you this because I want to ask you the next question connected with what I think is like a quixotic, also almost absurd effort. I translated Don Quixote into Spanglish, this mix of and when the first chapter came out, there was an international uproar. The Royal Academy of the Spanish Language said that I was persona non grata. There were death threats. And I did it because I wanted Don Quixote to be also in the language of the 50 million Latinos. So my question to you, Arun, is who's going to read this book? Who is your target audience? In what way, when you are translating into Yiddish, you are thinking of the many voices of potential readers that might or might not? Or is this a book that is really meant to be a nostalgic time capsule that people buy it and put it in their bookshelf and say, yes, Harry Potter is published, but nobody will read it?
Yeah, I think that it's undeniable that some portion of people who are buying the book are buying it simply to have it on their shelf and people to come in and perhaps they think it's funny or cute or culturally valuable. And those are all certainly attitudes that I've come across. And that may be the case. I really wrote this in many ways as a bringing together of much of what I think of as my Yiddishist education. And when I say the term Yiddishist, I'm referring to the small but dedicated group of people who work to continue to speak in Yiddish and create culture and literature in a way which is a continuation of the Alteheim, of the old home of Europe, of Eastern Europe, where our ancestors came from. And I tried to do this in a couple of different ways by incorporating old world dialects into the book. For example, in the original, Hagrid is speaking a country bumpkin West Country accent, so I had him speak in Galicianer Yiddish, which is caricaturized as being country bumpkin, and I had some of the other characters, some of the more, let's say, buttoned-up characters, speak with the Litvish Yiddish.
From Lithuania, the Litvak Yiddish.
Yes, correct. Northeastern Yiddish, spoken in Lithuania and northeastern Poland. And I think there were many ways. Of course, if you look at the book, you will immediately see that it's written in Yiddishist, quote-unquote, orthography, typically employing more punctuation, more nikudis, more vowel symbols under the letters. And so I see myself very much as a continuation of this Yiddishist tradition and effort. That's the family that I come from. And I think the question I have for you, Dr. Stavans, you've, of course, written extensively about Spanglish, and you've written about English as well. And Yiddish itself has a century-long tradition of importing English words into it, and more recently, Hasidic varieties of Yiddish have come under criticism for bringing in English words. And I think it creates a really interesting, challenging paradox where you have, whereas with Spanish, nobody's saying that Spanglish is Spanish, right? It has a name, Spanglish. Same with English, right? Leo Rostin was not claiming that this was Yiddish. Whereas today we have a situation where Hasidim, who are a growing and flourishing demographic and speak Yiddish day to day, call their language Yiddish. Okay, they write it with an aleph at the beginning instead of a yud. But Yiddishists call it Yiddish as well. So I'm curious how you think about today's paradoxical model and that tension, and what models we have that we can look to from the past to help to resolve that tension and make it productive and fruitful.
It's an excellent question, Arun, and I thank you for it. My view of language is that if there is one constant in it, is that it is always changing. No matter the language that one looks at, the strategies of survival of that language depend on malleability, to the capacity to change, to face the different circumstances. If Shakespeare came back right now from the grave and listened to you and I speaking the language right now, there would many, many words that he would not understand. They have come forth in the last 500 years that we have tacitly massaged into the language, and that we never think that they are recent acquisitions. So languages, in order to make it, have to be very dexterous, have to be very porous, incorporating elements from the outside and sharing elements that they have with others. I don't believe in purity of language. I think that languages that are pure are languages that are fossilized. Latin is a fossilized language. You can try to think how to say cursor in Latin or how to say airplane in Latin, but it is hard to listen to it because these are words that no daily speakers are using all the time. Now, the issue with Yiddish is absolutely off the charts. There are about 6,000 languages in the world today, languages that are spoken by vast numbers of people: Mandarin, English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, etc. And there are languages that are on the verge of disappearing. endangered languages in Africa, in Latin America. In Latin America, where I come from, it is often said that the death of the last speaker of a language is the death of the entire civilization that language represents. And indigenous languages are dying on a monthly basis because of the stresses that modernity puts on. But Yiddish is such a strange phenomenon. It is a language that has been around for quite some time. It is older than Shakespeare. When Shakespeare was writing, when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, there was already some form of Yiddish spoken in northern Germany. Yiddish has gone through so many permutations, and Yiddish is one of the only few languages in the world that has been systematically massacred by its enemies in order to be erased from the face of the earth. And yet, here we are using Yiddish, pushing it into the future and enabling it, just like we do with being Jewish, not to say no, but instead to say we're going to go forward. The challenge, however, is that the Yiddish that we speak today, the Yiddish that you and I would speak today, is very different, as you said, from the Yiddish that the majority of the Orthodox speak. And that to us might feel like threats and needles in our ears. But that was the first exposure that that was the first reaction that I had in my first exposure to Spanish when I was hearing it, when I came to the United States. And so I am not convinced that because of the English that the Hasidim are using, the different sects in large numbers, because of the infusion of the English languages. And sometimes for an English speaker, you can get a few things if you don't know any Yiddish, that represents the death of our Yiddish language. The death of our Yiddish language has been predicted so many times, and it's like Mark Twain, it has been highly inflated. It's likely that even novels are going to come out. I have heard of cases in which the groups of, I have seen them myself, a couple of Orthodox friends have read secretly some young adult novels that are published today in order to be able to write the equivalent in the Yiddish or English that they speak today for their young kids. If they are not going to read Harry Potter, they are going to read some kind of novel or some version of what we understand as a novel that will enable them to remain in the Orthodox community and to at the same time be entertained. Every community needs to find its own dynamic, its own force to keep its young part of the group, like you.
Yeah.
Now I want to ask you something. I want to go further with those nuances of Yiddish that you have here. When you were using the Galicianer Yiddish or the Yiddish from Lithuania, the Litvak Yiddish, for the different characters, there must have been in your mind a kind of explosion because you were Yiddishizing, not only language-wise, but religion and culture-wise, the characters. It seems to me in reading about halfway through your book that your Harry Potter is not only a rendition of J.K. Rowling's into Yiddish, but a Yiddishizing of the world of Harry Potter. And you make the characters inevitably feel Jewish.
It's funny that you say that. In many ways, I was trying to prevent anybody from feeling like I had done any sort of significant transformation. Of course, when you're speaking about translation, some sort of transformation is inevitable. But one of the things that I promised myself was that I was not going to explicitly turn the world of Harry Potter into a Jewish world. There's some fantastic Harry Potter Jewish fan fiction out there. Anybody who's interested, Google, you will find. But there was, I very much started off with the commitment to not renaming Harry to be Herschel and, not, for example, expunging the plot of any of its Christian character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You wanted to keep them the way they are in order not to, but still, because they speak in Yiddish, they feel like they are part of home. Now, I want to engage our viewers and engage you in the topic of translation in Yiddish. We were saying at the very beginning that you mentioned that the Yiddish has Don Quixote in it. It has Spinoza. It has the Bible. It has Dickens. It has Dante. Yiddish is a Jewish language that has, from the very beginning, been incredibly ambitious, not only to create something new like Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof, but to bring in from the world into it all these different literatures and to make the vast majority of Yiddish speakers capable of being contemporary with the rest of the world. Ladino, the other language that I'm very interested in, never had an enterprise of translating into it the works of Flaubert or the works of Goethe. Yiddish is incredibly cosmopolitan. Having grown up in it, how do you explain it?
It's an interesting question, and thinking about the translations that you mentioned today, many of them are being used by Yiddish learners, people wanting to learn more about Yiddish, improve their Yiddish, which is of course the ultimate irony. I think one of the things that struck me growing up, and I grew up in a modern Orthodox community in Teaneck, New Jersey, Yiddish seemed to me to be an incredibly global language, a language which crossed lines of religious affiliation, which certainly crossed geographic boundaries. And in many ways, especially I think starting in the 60s and 70s, attracted people from various fringes, particularly the LGBTQ community, which I think saw a bit of itself in how Yiddish was ostracized. So for me, Yiddish was absolutely a way to encounter other parts of the world, all within this frame and through the lens of Yiddish. And I'm curious to hear, Dr. Stavans, to what extent Yiddish played that role for you. You mentioned that it played the role of home in Mexico, but that when you came to America, you discovered this whole new world.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as you were speaking right now, Arun. And in putting together this anthology, how Yiddish changed America and how America changed Yiddish. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that I feel like an outsider into the anthology. I'm a Mexican, Yiddish bocher who is putting together as an editor an anthology about America, a country I have come to from the outside. My co-editor, Josh Lambert, is from Canada. So in some ways, we're sandwiching the American experience by enabling it to reflect on the dramatic changes that Yiddish has had. You can't think of Woody Allen, you can't think of Mel Brooks, you can't think of Seinfeld and Sarah Silverman, and you can't think of many other aspects that are literary, Bashevis Singer, Sol Bellow, Philip Roth, without thinking of the impact that Yiddish has had. The Yiddish that has also manifested itself in the food, in the jokes, in the grammar of the language. But, when we use the word America in the anthology, we use the word America in the broadest sense of the term. It is America, not only the United States, but it's America, the Americas. And there's a section in the book about Cuba, about Argentina, about Colombia, about Mexico, and about Canada too, because the Yiddish experience was there in a very manifested way. In fact, Argentina was one of the great magnets of Jewish immigration at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. There were Jewish gauchos in the Pampas. Yiddish was a language that really diversified itself and had an incredible literary impact. Now, I was thinking of your question in this regard. When you compare Hebrew and Yiddish, maybe if you and I were speaking 100 years ago, we would relate to these two questions in very different ways. The Holocaust had not yet taken place. the creation of the State of Israel had not taken place. Yiddish was the dominant Jewish language in the world. Hebrew was a language that wanted to be revived. Perhaps in Palestine, there were other options like Uganda or Argentina, where the Jewish state could be based. But Yiddish looked to be the winner. Hebrew looked to be yet ready for more years of that frozen state in which it had kept itself for centuries. And yet, just 100 years later, things turned around in dramatically and tragic ways. An enormous portion of the Yiddish-speaking population was erased from the face of the earth. There is a Jewish state today, embattled as it is, a Jewish state where Hebrew has become not only the religious language, but the national language. And ironically, Yiddish today generates nostalgia and affection and a certain type of, it's the underdog. Hebrew, on the other hand, is the language of a state, is a language of politics that can polarize the various constituencies. The Jewish history is so rapidly transformed by historical events that who knows what's going to happen in 100 years from now. Languages that might seem not to be at the forefront might be at the forefront. Locations where the Jews didn't think they would be living could be cultural and social centers, and types of literature that we never imagined might come to the fore.
You were talking about nostalgia, and I've been thinking a lot about that portion of the, I guess, non-readership, but people who are buying a book like Harry Potter in Yiddish, who are not intending to ever read it. Of course, I'm very happy to hear that some people have actually started learning Yiddish as a result of this book, which is wonderful. But to what extent does the function of nostalgia for Yiddish, which from what I can tell, and I'm not a scholar, but from what I can tell, there has been a nostalgia for Yiddish and for the old world for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. But I think that qualitatively needs to change once the kval, that original source, is no longer available to us. And I think a lot about how the community right after the Holocaust felt in many ways very ambivalent towards Yiddish. And it was the generation after that started to rediscover and be really curious, driven, I think, in many ways by that nostalgia. What fuels the next generation? How sustainable is nostalgia as a driving force for a nation?
Yes, these are very important questions and prophetic questions, difficult to answer. There's a scholar, a friend of mine, who says that the difference between Hebrew and Yiddish is the difference between a female language. She describes Yiddish as female and Hebrew as masculine. That in and of itself is controversial, but it invites thought to see how we approach each of these languages. I don't know, Arun, but I read somewhere that you are actually not fully satisfied with having finished your endeavor and are planning to translate more volumes of Harry Potter. This is not the only one that you're going to do. And maybe after that, you'll move into Chronicles of Narnia and Neil Gaiman. Are you going to bring the whole fantasy that has evolved in the English language into Yiddish?
You know, I think I like to think that works like Harry Potter and Narnia, and in general, Western European fantasy are universal, but of course they're not. They're very much culturally constrained, but for me, they certainly represent an entire world which I think that Yiddish could benefit from, firstly, for those committed speakers who are continue to be interested in perpetuating the language, and also those who are interested in learning the language. I am in the middle of book 2. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Hope to have that out by next year, Hanukkah. But I've been very much heartened by the response that we've seen so far. The first 1,000 copies sold out in 24 hours. The next 1,000 copies sold out in a matter of days, and we now have a third print, which is available now. I think the link is in the comments. I suppose the question is, to what extent am I really doing this for myself, and to what extent am I doing it for people?
And for that child of yours?
And yes, God willing, there will be a child
coming.
And I think that is really the one person that I know that I'm doing this for, and I hope that other people can enjoy it as well.
You remind me, and I say this in the most admiring sense. You remind me of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was the promoter of bringing back Hebrew from the rabbinical catacombs into the language of the future state of Israel. And when he moved from Eastern Europe through Turkey, finally to Jerusalem, he brought his child with him, and he forbid his child to speak with anybody around him in anything but Hebrew, because he didn't want his ears to be polluted. He wanted to raise the very first Hebrew-speaking child of the future state of Israel. There is even a letter where he says that he didn't want the child to listen to birds because that music might distract him. I'm not putting you as a Robinson Crusoe type of figure here that you're going to isolate your child. But in the end, I mean, all of us, I have 2 wonderful boys. We hope as writers to have many readers, but we also hope that the next generation includes our own children, and that they will be able to carry the torch.
Yeah, I think growing up, I felt a lot more pessimistic. I couldn't imagine that there would be a burgeoning Yiddishist world outside of the Hasidic community that would speak Yiddish, but I've been proven quite wrong. And I think that it's the flourishing of the digital world and of social media that has brought what has typically been a very decentralized group of Yiddishists scattered across the entire world, across the diaspora and in Israel, to be able to come together and rally and put our forces together to create new media, to share that with each other. And I think that another important aspect of that digitization has been that it's enabled the Hasidic world and the Yiddishist world to really be able to meet each other in a way that I think has not been possible in many ways for a number of years. And I think a lot about the digital homeland of Yiddish, and I've seen the same thing happen for Ladino as well. I really got into learning Ladino about 5 years ago, and I found ready at my fingertips not just the Ladino Comunità listserv that exists, but also Facebook groups and people just making videos. I think it's opened entirely new possibilities. And I'm in touch with a professor of Ladino who I've really been trying to push to translate Harry Potter into Ladino. I think that it would be a wonderful aspect.
I maybe bringing it back to where we started, Arun, I ask myself repeatedly, why do some languages survive and others don't? Why has Yiddish managed to defy expectations? Why do some languages in Latin America or Africa, the ones that I was mentioning to you, are unlikely to survive? And it seems to me that there needs to be a function for it. It is not only the hope that we want a language to exist, but it has to be a daily reason for it to exist, transactions, people getting angry, people falling in love in that language, people writing a little note to themselves in that language that tells them about the things that they are going to do next day. If that doesn't, nostalgia alone is not going to push this, but there's a few young people just like you that I see in Israel, in Latin America, in Europe, that are determined to keep this language alive and push it into the next realm. There are efforts to go back to the land in farms where people only speak Yiddish. There are new Yiddish courses in many universities where students, many non-Jews, are learning the language. I was flabbergasted by the fact that for, I don't know if I have this number right, 7 months, a Yiddish version of Fiddler on the Roof was in New York City. And other than opera, where you can see Puccini or Verdi in Italian, using a language other than English on Broadway is almost anathema. But for 7 months, there was this Yiddish version with Russian subtitles on the left and Yiddish and English subtitles on the right. And it strikes me that one of the most interesting aspects, as a friend of mine who was in the cast told me, is that several of the actors were non-Jewish Yiddish speakers. That in and of itself is fascinating. You don't have to be a Jew today to act in Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish or to use Yiddish. You don't have to be a Jew to read Harry Potter in Yiddish.
Indeed. And I think that there is, and I don't think that it needs to be pessimistic, but there's certainly something sobering about the fact that the non-Hasidic Yiddish-speaking community, of course, its death has been predicted for over 100 years, but that's really been sort of a wishful prediction. I wish Yiddish would just go away, but Yiddish until the Holocaust, and even beyond that, as there was an entire generation of people who were raised speaking the language, it really wasn't at risk for going away. And I think it is today that the organic option for the perpetuation of the language is no longer available to us, and that perpetuation must be artificial. I don't think that I don't think that it makes it impossible. I think that it certainly makes continuity possible, but it means that the new Deutis, the new generations, come not vertically, but perhaps laterally. And I think that as long as the Yiddishist community is around, that nostalgia will still be enabled, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Although I do think that today we've started to see that nostalgia being shifted towards the Hasidic community, towards the religious community. And maybe nostalgia is the wrong word, but a sort of fascination with that other, which seems so close and yet so far. I think that in parallel with Fiddler on the Roof and the other Yiddish media that we're seeing, we also see a lot of television shows and movies related to the Hasidic way of life. And I think that those two are connected in a number of very complex and interesting ways.
You know, it was Max Weinreich, a very famous, your mother is a linguist and a dictionary maker. And so you will know, and she will know well, about Max Weinreich, a very important linguist, who once said that the difference between a language and a jargon or a dialect is that a language has an army and a navy to protect it. Yiddish doesn't have an army and a navy.
And it never has.
And it never has. It doesn't have an address. Your book is published in Sweden. We're talking in Detroit. I'm Mexican. You're part India. This proves perfectly the diasporic nature of the Yiddish language. Whoever eventually comes from this new generation to Yiddish will find out that Yiddish has always been at the forefront. Not only in translations. I was thinking in the anthology, there is an interview with Paula Vogel, the author of Indecent, that is, of course, a play about Sholem Asch's God of Vengeance, the very first play on Broadway that had a kiss between two women, and it was so devastatingly controversial that the play had to be closed. The audience, the actors were put in jail. Ash had to be kind of exiled for a while. We were already edging into topics that would become center stage 30, 40, 50 years later on Broadway and in other places. Yiddish is incredibly prescient, is incredibly prophetic, and is incredibly cosmopolitan. I love that quality of the Yiddish language. And I love its humility, its persistence, its forward vision, maybe also its nostalgia. There are things you can say in Yiddish that you can't say in any other languages that are so touch deep in the heart. It has been such a pleasure. Arun, I don't know if maybe we'll bring back Jay here.
Hello.
Hello.
So we do have a few questions over in the comments link.
Yeah.
So from Sue Lutz, who is on our book fair committee. Hello, Sue. She says she has heard that translation needs to be from a language of less experience to a language of more experience or expertise. Do you find that that's true, as both of you are translators? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Let me start, Arun, and then you go back. I believe that I having lived almost half my life in the United States, I now translate back and forth from Spanish to English and back to Spanish. Some works that originated in Spanish, I have translated to English. Some works that have originated in English, I've translated to Spanish. It's because of my experience in both worlds, but I should say that having lived in the United States, the adult part of my life, my Spanish can be more bookish, and by this I mean more stilted, more professorial than the jargony, more jazzy English that I can use in a certain translation. So I can do things with English in translation that I can't do in Spanish anymore, because my Spanish is no longer the Spanish of day-to-day life in Latin America. And I will say one more thing, because I want to hear what you have to say. But recently, I've translated from Ladino, I've translated from Hebrew, I've translated from French and Italian, languages that I know. But recently, I have started to do something that is a little risky, and that is translate from languages I don't know. Joseph Brodsky, the Nobel Prize winner from Russia, once translated from Spanish into Russian without knowing a word of Spanish. And his translations, Samuel Beckett translated also into Russian from Russian without having knowledge of it. I find fascinating the role of the translator who, with the help of a Virgil, a kind of a support individual, will receive the knowledge of a particular language and then reconstruct a poem in that language. That is quixotic. But what are your thoughts on translation?
I'm thinking about, Dr. Stavans, what you said earlier about Yiddish being a cosmopolitan language, a language without a homeland, and one which I think perhaps as a result of that, anybody who did not grow up in quote-unquote Yiddish land, whether that's Williamsburg or Warsaw, is going to be an immigrant to the language. And that comes with certain challenges in building proficiency. And I think that this is a woe that any Yiddish teacher will certainly identify with. I myself, who grew up speaking Yiddish at home, found that because I had never received a formal education the way that you did, in Mexico, I was missing large aspects of the linguistic sphere that would be required. Forget translating, just to read Yiddish literature. But I think over time, as I've spent many years learning many different languages, and none of them to perfection, I've come to terms with the fact that I'm never going to be perfectly bilingual in English or Yiddish. My Yiddish will always be stronger in certain ways than my English. My English will be stronger in certain ways than my Yiddish, and my Tamil, which is weaker than both, will have certain strong points that I can't quite access in English or Yiddish. And I think my strategy for Yiddish is to know that I'm not going to be able to produce something the way that somebody from 2 generations ago who was born in Warsaw could, but I can work with the best language experts that we have, work with the best editors, and apply myself to the extent that I'm able to get to the level of proficiency that's required. And you know, I'm proud of the work that I've put out, and of course, it can always be better.
I love how you're presenting this, Arun, and I want to say 2 things before Jamie comes back. The first is the concept of being an immigrant to a language, as you just put it, is endearing to me. One is not only an immigrant to a country, one is an immigrant to a language too, and maybe that is even harder because you can be exiled from a language. My Bobbe Bella, my grandmother, left Poland in 1929 and promised herself never to speak a word of Polish again, her first language, because of how angry she was at the place that had aborted her. And she never did. And when she was very old, I tried to get her to say a few things in Polish, but she had made a promise to herself. She had exiled herself from a language that had been her home and didn't want to return in any way. The second thing that I want to say is that I love this concept. You know, I have a friend who tried to translate Shakespeare into Spanish using the Spanish language that was available in 1605 when the play was written, and not the Spanish language that is available today. He wanted to create the Shakespeare play, a Hamlet, that would be exactly contemporaneous with the Shakespeare production in English. And he did. It's an extraordinary feast, but it's totally unreadable. Nobody opens it because the readers today want something that is accessible. So I'm thankful that you did not produce a Harry Potter with the Yiddish of 1939, but with the Yiddish of 2020.
Well, of course, how would we say Muggle with the Yiddish of 1929?
Back to you, Jamie.
So I have 2 questions. One, speaking of the metamorphoses of language, so I did not grow up with Harry Potter the way you did, Arun, but I've read a few of them, and I've seen a couple of the movies. And are they goblins, gremlins, whoever's in charge of the bank? I find them a bit difficult. So I started reading your translation. I was reading it so slowly, I didn't get very far. How do you deal with a stereotype like that when translating into the Mama Lotion?
Yeah, I think one thing to acknowledge is that the stereotype of the money-grubbing Jew and that depiction as a goblin, that is one which is very much entrenched in European culture and folklore. And Harry Potter is just one of at the end of many works that take advantage of that caricature. I actually did one thing which I'm not sure how I feel about, but I had them speak in a way which echoed how Jews in the Middle Ages would sometimes speak when they knew that there were German-speaking non-Jews around. They would use certain Hebrew terms so that they could avoid being found out or detected. And that was my one, I think, just reference to the fact that goblins, in many ways, as an oppressed group, I mean, I don't find them to be particularly unsympathetic. They're loyal, and they're fierce, and they're oppressed. So I think it's impossible to ignore that stereotype, but I didn't find that the particularly pernicious aspects of that really came out in Harry Potter.
Let me say something before Jamie comes back. You know, being a scholar of translation, there are many instances in which translators have done something even more, I don't know what word to use, Arun, courageous or cowardly, and that is that they have eliminated entire chapters of books that they found to be offensive or not at the level of the rest of the book. One translator into French of Don Quixote decided not to include the very last chapter because he was so sad that Don Quixote was going to die that he decided not to kill him with the hope that somebody else would write another sequel to the book. So on the one hand, every translator has to deal with aspects that the author might include that are repellent or uncomfortable or, you know, generating all sorts of mixed emotions. There is also another aspect that I think is important for people to remember when dealing with translations. There are certain parts of books that are not always at the level of other parts of the book. A book isn't homogeneously and uniformly even, and the translator is the closest reader a book ever gets. The one that ends up knowing all the tricks of the author, sometimes better than the author herself. And I have on occasion wondered if a translation can be better than the original, can improve the original, can cure some of the defects, the discomforts, and allow the readers of the target language to enjoy something that the readers of the original language don't. But anyway, that is just a fantasy of mine. Jamie, we'll go back to you.
That's quite. I like that fantasy. So I would like to invite you both a bit to plug the Yiddish Book Center. I know, Dr. Stavans, you're involved with them. You work for them. They are, of course, an important force in the world of maintaining Yiddish. So let's hear. Some of our audience may be familiar, some may not. So why don't give us the whole spiel?
With enormous pleasure. The Yiddish, I teach at Amherst College, and in my many itinerant journeys in life, I happened to stop by when I was young, the Yiddish Book Center, which at that point was in a storage house in Western Mass, and was just overwhelmed with emotion by it. And it is the reason why I ended up in Amherst. I got the job later on, etc. But that was the place I wanted to live. I live only about 2 miles away from the Yiddish Book Center. It is a gravitational force in my life. I am very active in many activities at the center. I love the concept that Aaron Lansky brought about of rescuing books that people were throwing away in building a submerged, it's in a bunker, a submerged library of Yiddish classics that would be protected for generations. It's a very Jewish concept, and pushing it to the next level by opening the books through events, through teachings and camps to the next generation. I think that the Yiddish Book Center is a lesson of a cultural activism that many of us need to learn from. I have imagined for myself if something similar with Ladino could happen, the creation of a Ladino book center where books from all over the world are stationed in one place, all in Ladino for people to be able to read them. I love the fact that it's in Western Mass. It's not in New York City. It's not in Miami. It's not in LA. It's not in Jerusalem. It's in this middle of nowhere, Western Massachusetts, where it doesn't have to be victim of the political intricacies of the Yiddish world. It is neutral. It is in the forest, and people can come to it. My life would be very different if I had not stopped by the Yiddish Book Center 30 or so years ago. A lot of the writing that I've done, I'm about to complete a biography of Isaac Bashevis Singer that much of the research was at YIVO and at the Yiddish Book Center. It's an institution that I adore.
Dr. Stavans, you mentioned opening up all of those Yiddish books to future generations. Actually having access to the digitized texts, which have been made available by OCR technology to make them fully searchable, was actually one of the critical resources that I used in trying to understand how was magic and the associated terminology approached in previous Yiddish literature. And so without having actually read Don Quixote in Yiddish, I've come across it in my search results many times, and I'd like to think that in many ways my translation incorporates pieces of all this Yiddish literature, which has now been made available to really anybody who has a search engine at their fingertips.
It's the only complete literary tradition that is all digitized in a single place. You can see every single book that was published in Yiddish at any point, from the Zene Rene to Glickel to the Brothers Zinger, digitized. And I, not too long ago, Arun, I was browsing through that digital archive and found a work by a Polish Yiddish speaking immigrant who had made it to Mexico in the 1920s, became friends with Diego Rivera, just out of nowhere. And Diego Rivera agreed to make drawings for him for his next Yiddish book. It's called Stadt vom Palatzen, Itzhak Berliner, and it's an absolute jewel, this Yiddish poems, and the Diego Rivera that is probably the most canonized of all Mexican artists. Last thing that I will say is that this anthology, How Yiddish Changed America and How America Changed Yiddish, it brings together the best of the magazine, Bachenträger, of the Yiddish Book Center. We, Josh Lambert and I, scanned many issues. It's many years. The institution is turning 40 this year. Found what we thought was the best and put it together in this anthology. And the response has also been just superb. Just like the terrific story about the 2 printings and now the 3rd of the Harry Potter in Yiddish. This is already in its 3rd printing, and people have been very excited about it. Jamie, we return to you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to our 2 guests, Dr. Stavans, one of the editors of this handy volume, How Yiddish Changed America and How America Changed Yiddish. And you're going to have to hold up my copy of Arun's translation there. Oh, there we go. I had to send mine because it is sold out.
And we should say also that Arun has behind him a Harry Potter that is up looking on his shoulder.
See, it's good luck charm. This book can be found at our bookstore on bookshop.org. There's a link in the description. There's also a link to how you can pre-order Harry Potter in Yiddish, which should be coming out when, Arun?
I believe that will be shipping, or not we, my Swedish publisher will be shipping out, I believe, at the end of August. But okay. I would strongly recommend placing a pre-order now, because if past trends say anything, it won't be available for long.
Right. So place that pre-order now. You should get it soon. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all of those YouTube things so that we know we love you and you love us. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeshe koach, Arun. Bye-bye.